The clock on Sarah Mitchell's dashboard showed 8:45 p.m. as she drove her black BMW through the quiet streets of downtown Atlanta. The streetlights cast long shadows across her tired face, reflecting off her wire-rimmed glasses. At 42 years old, Sarah had spent the last 15 years building her reputation as one of Georgia's most respected state attorneys, specializing in civil rights cases. Today had been particularly long. She had just finished preparing for a major case that would begin trial next week, and her briefcase in the passenger seat was stuffed with important documents. The leather seat still held the warmth from her 12-hour workday at the courthouse. As she turned onto Peachtree Street, Sarah checked her mirrors, a habit she had developed over years of careful driving. Her signal light clicked rhythmically as she made a proper turn. The roads were mostly empty, with only a few cars passing by at this hour. She thought about the leftover pasta waiting in her fridge and looked forward to finally getting home to her modern apartment in Midtown. That's when she saw them, the bright blue and red lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Sarah's heart rate increased slightly, but she remained calm. She had done nothing wrong. Following proper procedure, she turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over smoothly to the right side of the road. The police cruiser stopped about 10 feet behind her car. Through her side mirror, Sarah watched as Officer James Davidson stepped out of his patrol car. He was a tall man, probably in his mid-30s, with broad shoulders and a stern expression that was visible even in the dim evening light. What caught her attention immediately was how his right hand hovered near his weapon, an unnecessary gesture that made her stomach tighten. Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself of her rights. She had handled dozens of police misconduct cases and knew exactly how these situations should properly proceed. The dashboard clock now read 8:47 p.m. She made a mental note of the time, another habit from her years of legal work. Officer Davidson approached her car with heavy footsteps, his boots scraping against the asphalt. His flashlight beam swept across her rear window before settling directly on her side mirror, intentionally reflecting back into her eyes. Sarah squinted but maintained her composed posture. "License and registration," Officer Davidson barked, his tone unnecessarily harsh. He didn't introduce himself or explain why he had pulled her over, both violations of standard police procedure. "Good evening, officer," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Davidson's response came with a sneer. "I'll ask the questions here. License and registration now." Sarah noticed two teenagers across the street had stopped walking and were now watching the scene unfold. One of them had taken out their phone and was holding it up, likely recording. She made another mental note of these potential witnesses. "Officer, I'm happy to provide my documents, but I have a right to know why I've been stopped," Sarah stated firmly, her years of legal experience evident in her measured tone. The beam of the flashlight moved directly to her face. "You made an illegal turn back there," Officer Davidson claimed, though Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had signaled properly and followed all traffic laws. Moving with deliberate slowness, Sarah reached for her purse on the back seat. "I'm going to get my license from my purse," she announced clearly, following best practices for traffic stops. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Officer Davidson suddenly shouted, his right hand now fully resting on his weapon. Several cars drove past, slowing down to observe the scene. The group of onlookers across the street had grown to 4 people, all with phones out. Through her side mirror, Sarah could see that Officer Davidson's body camera was turned on, its small red light blinking in the darkness. What happened in the next few moments would later become a turning point in Georgia's law enforcement history, but for now, Sarah Mitchell, one of the state's most accomplished attorneys, sat perfectly still in her BMW, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, about to experience firsthand the very injustice she had spent her career fighting against. Officer Davidson's flashlight beam continued to shine directly into Sarah's eyes as the situation grew more tense. The night air felt heavy with humidity, and small beads of sweat formed on Sarah's forehead, despite the cool air conditioning in her car. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Davidson commanded, his voice growing louder. His hand was still resting on his weapon, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the growing number of onlookers across the street. Sarah spoke clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by both the officer's body camera and the phones recording the incident. "Officer, I want to cooperate, but I'd like to explain something first. I'm a state attorney, and I work at... I don't care if you're the Queen of England. Officer Davidson cut her off sharply. I said step out of the vehicle. Now. Sarah noticed how his southern accent grew stronger with his rising anger. She carefully reached for her state attorney's badge on the passenger seat, moving slowly to ensure her actions were visible. Ma'am, if you don't step out right now, I'll have to remove you myself, Officer Davidson threatened, taking a step closer to her door. The red light on his body camera continued to blink steadily in the darkness. A second police car pulled up behind Officer Davidson's cruiser, its lights also flashing. Sarah could see in her mirror that the new officer was younger, maybe in his mid-20s. He approached cautiously, looking uncertain about the situation. "What seems to be the problem here, Davidson?" the young officer asked, his nameplate reading Officer Torres. "This woman is being uncooperative," Officer Davidson replied quickly, "and I spotted suspicious movement when I first pulled her over." Sarah kept her voice steady as she addressed Officer Torres. "I was simply reaching for my state attorney's identification. I've made no suspicious movements, and your dash cams will confirm this." The mention of dash cams made Officer Davidson's face twitch with obvious irritation. The crowd across the street had grown to about 12 people now, all witnessing the scene unfold. Some had started to whisper among themselves, and Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations about police harassment. "Last warning," Officer Davidson barked. "Exit the vehicle." Sarah knew her rights, but she also knew that escalating the situation further could be dangerous. With careful movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened her car door. The evening air hit her face as she stepped out, her high heels clicking against the pavement. Standing at her full height in her navy blue suit, Sarah cut an impressive figure. Several onlookers gasped as they recognized her from recent news coverage of a high-profile civil rights case she had won. "Place your hands on the hood of the car," Officer Davidson ordered, seemingly unaware of the murmurs of recognition from the crowd. "Officer Torres," Sarah said calmly, "I'd like to note that this stop has no legal basis. I'm Sarah Mitchell, lead civil rights prosecutor for the state of Georgia. My ID is on my passenger seat, and I'd appreciate if you verify my identity." Officer Torres hesitated, clearly recognizing her name. But before he could respond, Officer Davidson moved behind Sarah and roughly grabbed her wrists. "You're interfering with the police investigation," he growled, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clicked coldly against Sarah's wrists. The young woman who had first started recording called out, "This isn't right. We all know who she is." Officer Torres stepped forward, his face showing growing concern. "Davidson, maybe we should." "Stay back, Torres. I've got this under control," Davidson snapped, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. Sarah remained dignified as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. She spoke loudly and clearly for all the recordings. "I want everyone to witness that I'm complying fully while reserving my right to challenge the legality of this arrest. Officer Davidson, your body camera is on, correct?" The question seemed to anger him further. He turned Sarah around roughly, causing her to stumble slightly in her heels. The crowd's angry murmurs grew louder. As Sarah was led toward the police car, she caught sight of her reflection in her BMW's window. In her tailored suit and handcuffs, she presented a powerful image that would soon be seen by millions across the country. But for now, she focused on memorizing every detail of this encounter, knowing that what happened next would matter not just for her, but for countless others who faced similar treatment without her privileges or platform. The back seat of the police car was cold and uncomfortable as Sarah sat with her hands cuffed behind her back. Through the window, she could see Officer Davidson roughly searching through her BMW, pulling papers from her briefcase and tossing them carelessly onto the seat. "He can't do that," a voice shouted from the growing crowd. "That's an illegal search." The crowd had now grown to about 30 people. Many held their phones high, recording everything. Cars driving by slowed down to see what was happening, and some even parked nearby to join the observers. Officer Torres stood nervously by his patrol car, talking quickly into his radio. Sarah could read his body language. He knew something was very wrong with this situation. Every few seconds, he would glance at her in the back seat, then look away quickly. Inside the police car, Sarah focused on remembering every detail, The time on the car's digital clock read 9:03 p.m. The car number was 247. She could see Officer Davidson's name tag clearly in the streetlight. Badge number 8867. All these details would be important later. Davidson, Officer Torres called out suddenly. The station is asking for an update. They want to know why we're detaining a state attorney. Officer Davidson's head snapped up from where he was searching Sarah's car. He stormed over to Officer Torres, leaving the BMW's door wide open. Who called it in? He demanded loudly. One of the witnesses posted it on social media, Torres explained, holding up his phone. It's already spreading. The chief wants answers. Sarah could see Officer Davidson's face turning red, even in the dim light. He walked back to her car and slammed the door shut, then approached the police car where she sat. Opening the back door, he leaned in close. Listen here, he said in a low voice, forgetting about his body camera still recording. You might think you're something special, but right now you're just another. Officer Davidson, Sarah interrupted calmly, looking directly into his eyes. Everything you're doing is being recorded. There are witnesses everywhere. And you still haven't told me why I was stopped. A new police car arrived at the scene, this one unmarked. A tall black woman in a police captain's uniform stepped out. Captain Angela Roberts was well known in the community for her work in police reform. Davidson, step away from the vehicle. Captain Roberts's voice cut through the night air like a knife. The crowd parted as Captain Roberts walked toward them. Many people were now streaming the scene live on their phones. Some had recognized Captain Roberts and were whispering about how things were about to change. Captain, Officer Davidson started, standing up straight. This suspect was. Suspect. Captain Roberts's voice was sharp. That's Sarah Mitchell, our state's leading civil rights prosecutor. Release her. Now. But she was resisting. The only thing I see here is a serious violation of police procedure, Captain Roberts said firmly. Remove those handcuffs immediately. Officer Davidson's hands shook slightly as he took the handcuffs off Sarah. The crowd cheered as she stepped out of the police car, rubbing her wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. Miss Mitchell, Captain Roberts said respectfully, on behalf of the department, I deeply apologize for this incident. We will be launching a full investigation. Sarah straightened her suit jacket and spoke clearly, knowing she was still being recorded. Thank you, Captain Roberts. I appreciate your quick response. However, this isn't just about me. This is about every person who faces this kind of treatment without having my privileges and position. She turned to face Officer Davidson, who was now standing stiffly beside his patrol car. Officer Davidson, I want you to know that tomorrow I'll be filing a formal complaint. Not for revenge, but because the system only changes when people with power stand up for those without it. The crowd had grown silent, listening to her words. Even the teenagers who had first recorded the incident stood quietly, their phones still filming. Officer Torres stepped forward. Ms. Mitchell, your car wasn't properly searched. Would you like me to help you collect your documents? Sarah nodded, then turned back to Captain Roberts. I'll need copies of all body camera footage, dash cam recordings, and the official stop report. And Captain, I hope you'll work with me to make sure this becomes a teaching moment for the department. As Sarah walked back to her BMW, people from the crowd began to clap. She had handled the situation with dignity and strength, turning a moment of injustice into an opportunity for change. But the real work, she knew, would begin tomorrow. 10 police officers stood quickly and backed away from their desks when Sarah Mitchell walked into the police station. Her heels clicked against the floor as she approached the front desk, still wearing the same navy blue suit from her arrest 2 hours ago. I need to speak with Chief Anderson, she said calmly. The desk sergeant's eyes widened as he recognized her. Miss Mitchell, I'm so sorry about what happened. Let me call the chief right away. His hands shook as he picked up the phone. Inside the station, whispers spread like wildfire. That's Sarah Mitchell, the civil rights lawyer. Davidson arrested her. Oh man, he's in big trouble. Officers peeked around corners to catch a glimpse of the woman who had won dozens of cases against police departments. Chief Thomas Anderson's office door flew open. He was a tall man with gray hair and 30 years of police experience. Right now, he looked worried. Miss Mitchell, please come in, he said, gesturing to his office. Can I get you some water? Coffee? Water would be fine, Sarah replied, sitting down in the leather chair across from his desk. She noticed her arrest report already sitting on top of his papers. Just then, Officer Davidson burst into the office without knocking. "Chief, I can explain." "Sit down, Davidson." Chief Anderson's voice was sharp. "You've done enough damage tonight." The young desk sergeant hurried in with a bottle of water for Sarah, nearly tripping over his feet as he set it down. Through the office windows, she could see more officers gathering, trying to watch what was happening. "Let's review what occurred tonight," Sarah said, opening her briefcase. "Officer Davidson pulled me over without cause, refused to listen when I identified myself as a state attorney, conducted an illegal search of my vehicle, and put me in handcuffs. All of this was captured on his body camera, dash cam, and at least 15 civilian phones." Officer Davidson's face turned red. "You are acting suspicious." "Acting suspicious?" Sarah interrupted, her voice still calm but firm. "Or just being black in an expensive car." Chief Anderson closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. "Davidson, you didn't check her ID." "She could have been lying about being a lawyer," Davidson muttered. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened a video. "This is from your own dashcam, Officer Davidson. You can clearly see my state attorney's badge on the passenger seat when you searched my car. Would you like to explain why you ignored it?" The room fell silent. Through the window, more officers had gathered, watching the scene unfold. Even the cleaning lady had stopped mopping to peek inside. "Chief Anderson," Sarah continued, "I've spent my career fighting for civil rights. I've seen hundreds of cases like this, but tonight, I experienced it firsthand." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at all the officers watching. "I could file a lawsuit right now. I could end careers, but that's not why I'm here." Chief Anderson leaned forward. "What do you want, Ms. Mitchell?" "I want change," she said, turning back to face them. "Real change, starting with Officer Davidson." Davidson looked up, surprise on his face. "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow morning, I'm launching a new police training program on racial bias. Officer Davidson will be the first participant." She smiled slightly. "Consider it your chance to learn from this mistake instead of losing your badge." The chief sat back in his chair, relief showing on his face. "You're offering us a way out." "I'm offering a way forward," Sarah corrected him. "Because the next person Officer Davidson stops might not be a state attorney. They might not have witnesses with phones. They might not know their rights." She picked up her briefcase and walked to the door. "The training starts at 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late, Officer Davidson." As she walked through the station, officers moved aside, creating a path. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked ashamed. A young black female officer at her desk whispered "thank you" as Sarah passed. Outside, the night air felt cool on her face. Sarah took a deep breath and looked back at the station. Tomorrow would be the start of something new. Sometimes, she thought, real justice isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sarah Mitchell's office as she watched the news coverage of her arrest on her laptop. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the video went viral. In just 12 hours, the incident had become national news. "Sarah, you need to see this," said Marcus Johnson, her longtime assistant, rushing into the office with his tablet. The video hit 20 million views. People are sharing their own stories of police encounters in the comments. It's becoming a movement. Sarah took off her reading glasses and rubbed her tired eyes. She hadn't slept much last night, spending hours documenting every detail of the incident while it was fresh in her memory. Her wrists still showed faint marks from the handcuffs. "How many interviews have we been asked to do?" she asked, looking at the stack of messages on her desk. "CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, every major network wants you," Marcus replied, scrolling through his notes. "And civil rights groups from across the country are calling. They want you to speak at their events." A knock on the door interrupted them. Jennifer Wham, Sarah's colleague and friend from law school, entered with a concerned look on her face. "The mayor's office just called. They want to meet with you immediately." Sarah stood up, straightening her dark gray suit. "What about Officer Davidson? Did he show up for the training program?" "Yes." Jennifer nodded. "Captain Roberts called earlier. He arrived on time and actually seems different. The video of his own behavior seems to have shaken him." As Sarah gathered her things for the mayor's meeting, her office TV showed footage from last night. The video of her arrest played again, followed by interviews with witnesses from the scene. One teenage girl was crying as she described how scared she felt watching the officer's aggressive behavior. "Look at this," Marcus said, holding up his phone. Black women lawyers across the country are sharing their own stories of discrimination. Your incident has opened up a bigger conversation. Sarah paused to watch the coverage. The news anchor was interviewing a legal expert who explained how Sarah's case highlighted the ongoing issues of racial profiling and police misconduct. "We need to do more than just talk," Sarah decided, turning to her colleagues. "Marcus, call every civil rights organization that contacted us. Tell them I'm not interested in just giving speeches. I want to work on real policy changes." Jennifer smiled, knowing that look in her friend's eyes. "What are you planning?" "This isn't just about one bad officer," Sarah explained, walking to her whiteboard and picking up a marker. "The system needs fixing. I'm thinking mandatory bias training, regular review of traffic stop data, body camera requirements." She started writing quickly, her neat handwriting filling the board with ideas. Marcus and Jennifer watched as their normally reserved colleague transformed into a force for change. "The police union won't like this," Jennifer warned. "They don't have to like it," Sarah replied firmly. "But after last night's video, they'll have to listen. Public opinion is on our side for once." Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Captain Roberts. "Officer Davidson just shared his story with the training class. People are listening. Thank you for giving him this chance." Sarah showed the message to her colleagues. "See, change is possible, but it has to be more than just one department, one officer, or one incident." As they prepared to leave for the mayor's office, a young black female law intern knocked on the door. Her eyes were wide with admiration as she looked at Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I just wanted to say, watching how you handled last night, staying professional and turning it into something positive, it reminded me why I wanted to become a lawyer." Sarah walked over and placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "What's your name?" "Tanya Williams, ma'am." "Well, Tanya, would you like to help us draft some new police reform legislation? We're going to need the next generation of lawyers to carry this forward." Tanya's face lit up with excitement. "Really? I'd be honored." As they all walked out of the office together, Sarah noticed more young interns and lawyers gathering in the hallway, watching her with new respect. Her humiliating arrest was transforming into something powerful, a catalyst for change that would affect not just her city, but potentially the entire country. The mayor could wait a few more minutes, she decided. First, she had some future leaders to inspire. 1 week after the incident, Sarah sat in a large conference room at the Internal Affairs Department. The walls were covered with data charts, maps, and photographs. 6 investigators worked at computers, analyzing years of traffic stop records from Officer Davidson and other officers in the department. "Ms. Mitchell, you need to see this," called out Maria Rodriguez, the lead investigator. She pointed to her computer screen, which showed a map of the city with hundreds of colored dots. Each dot represents one of Officer Davidson's traffic stops over the past 3 years. Sarah leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. The pattern was clear. Most of the dots clustered around predominantly minority neighborhoods, even though these weren't high-crime areas. "There's more," Maria continued, clicking to another screen. "We found text messages between Officer Davidson and some other officers. They were keeping an unofficial contest about who could make the most stops each month." The room grew quiet. Detective James Chen, who had been reviewing body camera footage from dozens of stops, stood up from his desk. The language they used in these messages. He shook his head in disgust. They called it hunting season. They targeted specific neighborhoods during certain hours when people would be coming home from work. Sarah wrote notes in her leather-bound notebook, the same one she had in her car the night of her arrest. How many other officers were involved in this contest? 7, Maria answered, handing over a list of names. But 3 of them stopped participating after a few months. They said it felt wrong. Just then, Captain Roberts entered the room, carrying a stack of files. Dark circles under her eyes showed she had been working long hours too. "The good news," Captain Roberts announced, "is that Officer Davidson is actually making progress in the training program. He's been sharing his story with other officers, admitting his biases. Yesterday, he broke down crying while watching videos of his own stops. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, and the other officers involved in the contest. 2 have requested to join the training program voluntarily, Captain Roberts replied. The others are still denying any wrongdoing. The door opened again, and Tanya Williams, the young intern, rushed in excitedly. Ms. Mitchell, the data analysis you requested is finished. It's even worse than we thought. Everyone gathered around as Tanya connected her laptop to the large screen on the wall. Charts and graphs appeared, showing years of traffic stop statistics. Look at this, Tanya pointed. In the past 5 years, minority drivers were 6 times more likely to be stopped in our city, but less than 1% of these stops found any actual violations. Sarah stood up and walked to the screen, her heels clicking on the tile floor. This is exactly what we needed. Hard evidence that can't be denied. Maria raised her hand. There's something else you should know. We found similar patterns in other police departments across the state. This isn't just a local problem. The room buzzed with conversation as everyone processed this information. Sarah turned to face the team, her expression determined. Okay, here's what we're going to do, she announced. First, we'll complete the investigation of our department. Every officer involved in discriminatory practices will be held accountable. She walked to the whiteboard and started writing. Second, we'll use this evidence to push for mandatory bias training across the state. Third, we'll implement a new system to monitor traffic stops in real time. Captain Roberts stepped forward. The police union won't like this. The union needs to understand something, Sarah replied firmly. This isn't about punishing police. It's about protecting everyone's rights, including good officers who want to do their jobs fairly. Tanya raised her hand nervously. Ms. Mitchell, some officers are saying you're just doing this for revenge because of what happened to you. Sarah smiled gently at the young intern. That's why we let the evidence speak for itself. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers tell a clear story of systemic bias. As the team returned to their work, Sarah looked around the room. Here were people from different backgrounds. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, all working together to fix a broken system. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she decided to turn her arrest into an opportunity for change. Her phone buzzed with a text from Officer Davidson. Can we talk? I want to help make things right. Sarah showed the message to Captain Roberts, who nodded encouragingly. Sometimes, she thought, real change starts with one person admitting they were wrong and wanting to do better. 3 months after Sarah Mitchell's arrest, the police department's largest conference room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and police officers. The air felt tense with anticipation as Chief Anderson approached the podium, with Sarah and Officer Davidson sitting behind him. Today marks a turning point for our department, the chief began, his voice carrying across the silent room. We're here to announce major changes in how we operate and to show real accountability for past mistakes. Camera flashes lit up the room as journalists captured every moment. In the front row, Sarah's team from the investigation sat together. Maria Rodriguez, Detective Chen, young Tanya Williams, and Captain Roberts. They had all worked countless hours to reach this day. Officer Davidson stood up next, looking different from the angry man who had arrested Sarah that night. His face showed the weight of what he had learned about himself over the past months. My name is Officer James Davidson, he began, his voice shaking slightly. 3 months ago, I arrested Sarah Mitchell without cause because of my own biases. Today, I want to publicly apologize and share what I've learned. The room grew even quieter as he continued. Through the training program, I discovered prejudices I didn't even know I had. I saw patterns in my behavior that hurt innocent people. I'm not the only one. Sarah watched him carefully. She had spent many hours working with Davidson in the training program, seeing his gradual transformation from defensive to genuinely remorseful. 7 other officers and I played a game, Davidson admitted, causing murmurs in the room. We competed to see who could make the most traffic stops in minority neighborhoods. We thought it was just police work. We were wrong. Phones recorded his confession as he explained the unofficial contest and its impact on the community. Some officers in the audience looked uncomfortable, while others nodded in understanding. Captain Roberts stepped forward next, holding up a thick report. Our investigation found clear evidence of systemic bias, but more importantly, we developed solutions. She outlined the new policies. Every traffic stop would now be recorded and reviewed monthly. Officers would undergo bias training every 3 months. A community oversight board would have access to all police data. Body cameras must stay on during entire shifts. Any officer showing patterns of discrimination would face immediate review. But the biggest change, Sarah said, standing up to join them at the podium, is in how we handle accountability. She gestured to Officer Davidson. Instead of just punishing officers who show bias, we're creating a program where they can learn, grow, and help teach others. Officer Davidson will be one of our first trainers. Davidson nodded, looking straight at the cameras. I'm not proud of my past actions, but I'm proud to be part of the solution now. From the audience, an elderly black woman stood up. Sarah recognized her as Mrs. Thompson, a community leader who had experienced police harassment herself. Officer Davidson, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice firm but kind, I've lived in this city for 60 years. I've seen a lot of promises from the police. Why should we believe anything will change? Davidson stepped forward, removing his badge. Ma'am, this badge means nothing if we don't earn the trust that comes with it. I'm willing to work every day to rebuild that trust. Sarah watched as Mrs. Thompson walked to the front of the room. The elderly woman stood face to face with Davidson, studying him carefully. I forgive you, she said finally. Not just for Ms. Mitchell, but for all the others who couldn't fight back. She turned to Sarah. Thank you for turning your pain into our progress. Tears formed in several eyes around the room. Even some of the journalists looked moved by the moment. Chief Anderson returned to the podium. Starting today, every officer will be evaluated based on how they build community trust, not how many stops they make. Those who can't or won't change will be removed from the force. As the press conference ended, Sarah noticed Tanya taking notes frantically. What are you writing? She asked the young intern. Everything, Tanya replied excitedly. This is history happening right in front of us. Real change, real accountability. Sarah smiled, remembering how she felt as a young lawyer witnessing important moments of justice. But this was different. This was change that would affect thousands of lives. As people began leaving the room, Officer Davidson approached her. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing the possibility of change in me when you had every right to demand punishment. Sarah nodded. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about transformation. 1 year after Sarah Mitchell's arrest, the state capitol building buzzed with excitement. The Grand Assembly Hall was filled to capacity, with people standing along the walls. News cameras lined the back of the room, their red lights blinking as they broadcast live across the nation. Sarah stood at the podium, wearing her favorite power suit, looking out at the diverse crowd before her. In the front row sat Officer Davidson, now wearing a training instructor's uniform, next to Captain Roberts and Mrs. Thompson from the community board. Behind them sat dozens of police officers and community members who had been part of the change over the past year. 1 year ago, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong, I was handcuffed on the side of the road. Today, I stand before you to share what that moment has created. She held up a thick document, the Mitchell Fair Policing Act, the result of countless hours of work, community meetings, and cooperation between police and citizens. In the past year, our pilot program has shown amazing results, Sarah continued, pointing to the large screen behind her showing statistics. Traffic stop complaints have dropped by 75%. Community trust in police has increased by 60%. And most importantly, our officers report feeling more satisfied with their work. Officer Davidson stood up when Sarah gestured to him. Officer Davidson, who once arrested me, has helped train over 500 officers in bias recognition. His story has become a powerful tool for change. The crowd applauded as Davidson nodded humbly. He had become a different person from the angry officer of 1 year ago. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah said, pulling out letters from her folder. Listen to what people are saying. She read from the first letter. Dear Ms. Mitchell, yesterday I was stopped by a police officer. Instead of fear, I felt respect. The officer explained everything he was doing and treated me like a human being. Your work is making a real difference. Tanya Williams, no longer an intern but now a full-time member of Sarah's team, stepped forward with more success stories. She had collected hundreds of testimonials from both citizens and police officers about the positive changes. The Mitchell Act isn't just about rules and regulations, Sarah explained, turning to a new page in her speech. It's about changing the culture of policing. Every traffic stop is now recorded and reviewed. Officers receive regular training. Community members have a real voice in police policies. From his seat, Officer Davidson raised his hand to speak. Sarah nodded, and he stood up. "A year ago, I was part of the problem," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "Now, I teach other officers how to recognize and change their biases. Ms. Mitchell didn't just change my career, she changed my life." Mrs. Thompson stood up next, her voice strong despite her age. "I've lived through the civil rights movement," she said. "I've seen promises come and go. But this time, we're seeing real change. Our children feel safer on the streets." Sarah waited for them to finish before continuing. "The Mitchell Act will require every police department in our state to follow these new standards. But this is just the beginning." She pointed to a group of visitors sitting in the balcony, police chiefs and lawmakers from other states who had come to learn about the program. 5 states have already requested our training materials," Sarah announced. 10 more are drafting similar laws. What happened to me that night was wrong, but look at what we built from it. Captain Roberts stepped up to join Sarah at the podium. Together, they unveiled a new police department motto: protect, serve, respect, unite. "This isn't just about police reform," Sarah concluded, looking around the room. "It's about building bridges between communities. It's about turning pain into progress. It's about believing that people can change." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. In the back of the room, young black law students who had come to witness the historic moment wiped tears from their eyes. Police officers in the audience stood tall, wearing new badges that symbolized their commitment to unbiased policing. As Sarah gathered her papers, she saw Tanya talking excitedly with a group of young officers. The next generation was already taking up the work of continuing the change. Officer Davidson approached her one last time. "Who would have thought," he said with a gentle smile, "that arresting you would end up being the best mistake I ever made?" Sarah smiled back. "Sometimes justice works in unexpected ways. The real victory isn't in punishing wrongs, it's in making things right." As she left the Capitol building that evening, Sarah saw police cars with the new motto driving past. Each one reminded her that change was possible: one honest conversation, one changed mind, one traffic stop at a time. The end wasn't really an end at all. It was just the beginning of something much bigger.